Eleanor observed the peeling walls of her small apartment, feeling the weight of years on her tired shoulders. At 68, her face was marked by deep wrinkles, silent witnesses to a life of hard work and sacrifices. Her eyes, once vibrant, now reflected a mixture of resignation and sadness that had never completely left her. The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway made her heart race. Eleanor knew what was coming. She had struggled for months to keep up with the rent, but medical bills and her meager salary as a gardener were not enough. The knock on the door sounded like a final sentence. "Mrs. Eleanor?" The deep voice on the other side of the door belonged to Mr. Miller, the building manager. "I need to speak with you." With a deep sigh, Eleanor opened the door. Mr. Miller, a middle-aged man with thin-rimmed glasses, seemed uncomfortable with the task at hand. "I regret to inform you, but the owner has decided to proceed with the eviction," he said, avoiding direct eye contact with Eleanor. "You have a week to vacate the apartment." Eleanor nodded silently. There was no surprise in her features, only resigned acceptance. "I understand, Mr. Miller. Thank you for letting me know." When the door closed, Eleanor allowed herself a moment of weakness. Silent tears ran down her wrinkled face as she wondered how things had come to this point. Her thoughts wandered to the past, to the day she made the most difficult decision of her life. Nearly 4 decades ago, Eleanor was a 29-year-old single mother, struggling to survive on the streets of a large, unforgiving city. Her son Richard was only 10 years old and was the light of her life. But poverty and desperation surrounded her on all sides, and she knew she couldn't offer him the future he deserved. With a broken heart, Eleanor made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her days. She decided to give Richard up for adoption, hoping he would have a chance at a better life. The night before the separation, Eleanor held her son in her arms, tears mingling as she tried to memorize every detail of his face. "My dear Richard," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, "I want you to know that I love you more than anything in this world. What I'm doing, it's out of love for you." Richard, confused and scared, clung to his mother. "But why do I have to go, Mom? I don't want to leave you." Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat, struggling to maintain composure. "Sometimes, my love, we have to do difficult things to protect those we love. You'll have a better life with people who can take care of you in a way that I can't right now." That night, Eleanor took from her neck a simple but beautiful necklace. It was a silver chain with a small heart-shaped locket. The necklace had been passed down for generations in her family, one of the few valuable things she still owned. "I want you to have this," she said, placing the necklace around Richard's neck. "This necklace belonged to my grandmother and her grandmother before that. It carries the love of our family. Whenever you wear it, remember that no matter where I am, my love will be with you." Richard touched the locket reverently, his large eyes fixed on his mother. "I'll keep it forever, Mom, I promise." The next day, with a broken heart, Eleanor handed Richard over to social services. The image of her son being taken away, looking back with tears in his eyes, would be etched in her memory forever. In the years that followed, Eleanor struggled to rebuild her life. She found work as a gardener in an affluent neighborhood, ironically not far from the mansion where Richard would end up growing up, although she didn't know that at the time. Day after day, she tended to the luxurious gardens of the rich houses, always with thoughts of her son, imagining where he might be and what his life might be like. Fate, however, has curious ways of weaving its threads. Unbeknownst to Eleanor, Richard had been adopted by a wealthy and influential couple who lived in that same neighborhood. Thomas and Margaret Anderson were known for their philanthropy and had decided to adopt after years of unsuccessful attempts to have biological children. Richard grew up in an environment of privilege, receiving the best education and all the opportunities money could buy. But despite the material comfort, something always seemed to be missing in his life. The necklace his birth mother had given him became his most prized possession, a tangible connection to a past he could barely remember. As Richard grew older, he became more and more like his adoptive father in business. He learned to be ruthless, to see the world in terms of profits and losses. The sweet and sensitive boy Eleanor had known was slowly buried beneath layers of ambition and pragmatism. At 30, Richard Anderson was a successful businessman, known for his astuteness in real estate investments. He had built an empire, buying and selling properties with almost mechanical efficiency. His personal life, however, was an emotional desert. Married to Sarah, a beautiful socialite, their relationship was more a partnership of convenience than a marriage of true love. It was at this time that fate decided to intervene again. Richard had recently acquired an apartment complex downtown with plans to renovate the place and drastically increase rents. It was a calculated business move with no consideration for the current tenants, many of whom were elderly or low-income families. On a sunny spring afternoon, Richard decided to make a surprise visit to the complex to inspect the progress of the renovations. Dressed in an impeccable suit, he walked the corridors, observing with critical eyes every detail that needed to be changed. That's when he saw her, an elderly lady, bent over a small improvised garden in the building's courtyard. Her calloused hands moved with surprising agility among the plants, pulling weeds and fluffing the soil. There was something about that scene that touched Richard in a way he couldn't explain. Approaching silently, he watched the woman work. Her face was partially hidden by a worn straw hat, but Richard could see the deep lines that marked her sun-tanned skin. "You seem to have a way with plants," he commented, his voice startling the old woman. Eleanor looked up, meeting Richard's gaze. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. There was something in those eyes that transported her back in time to a day long ago when she held her son for the last time. "Oh, thank you," she replied, her voice trembling. "I worked as a gardener for many years. The plants, they're good companions for a lonely old woman." Richard felt an inexplicable pang in his chest. There was something in that woman's voice, a familiarity he couldn't understand. "Have you lived here long?" Eleanor nodded, wiping her dirt-stained hands on her faded apron. "Almost 20 years. This place, it's the closest thing to a home I have." Eleanor's words weighed on Richard. He knew that his plans for the building would mean evicting people like her. For the first time in years, he felt a twinge of doubt about his business decisions. "I see," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Well, keep up the good work. The garden is beautiful." As he walked away, Richard couldn't help but look back. The image of the old lady lonely in her small garden was etched in his mind. That night, lying next to Sarah in their king-size bed, Richard couldn't sleep. His thoughts kept returning to the elderly gardener and the apartment complex. For the first time in his career, he wondered if he was doing the right thing. Sarah, noticing his restlessness, turned to him. "What's wrong, dear? You seem troubled." Richard hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm thinking about the downtown project. Maybe we should reconsider our approach." Sarah raised an eyebrow, surprised. It wasn't common to see her husband show any kind of doubt about business. "What do you mean?" "There are people living there, Sarah. People who have called that place home for years. I don't know if I can just evict them." Sarah studied Richard's face for a long moment. "This isn't like you, Richard." "What happened today?" Richard sighed, running his hand through his hair. "I met a lady today at the complex. She made me remember, well, I'm not sure exactly what, but it made me question things." Sarah took Richard's hand, intertwining their fingers. It was a rare gesture of intimacy between them. "You know, sometimes I wonder if you don't hide more from yourself than you realize. Maybe this is a sign to look more closely at what really matters." Sarah's words echoed in Richard's mind. He instinctively touched the necklace he always carried hidden under his shirt, the only link to a past he could barely remember. In the days that followed, Richard found himself returning to the apartment complex more frequently. He observed the residents, listened to their stories, and increasingly felt the weight of his previous decisions. Eleanor, in turn, noticed the frequent presence of the elegant man. There was something about him that intrigued her, a familiarity she couldn't explain. One afternoon, while working in her small garden, she saw him approach again. "You seem to like this place," she commented, a gentle smile on her lips. Richard stopped, surprised by the observation. Yes, I guess I do. There's something here that makes me feel connected." Eleanor nodded, understanding. "Sometimes places have that power over us. They hold memories, even those we don't know we have." Eleanor's words touched something deep in Richard. He sat on a nearby bench, his eyes fixed on the old woman. "You seem wise. Have you lived here long?" Eleanor laughed softly. "Oh, long enough to see many things, my young man. But you know it's not the amount of time that matters, but what we do with it." Richard felt a sudden urge to open up, to share the thoughts that were tormenting him. "Sometimes I wonder if what I do, if it's really the right thing, if I'm making a difference in the world, or just accumulating wealth without purpose." Eleanor stopped her work, turning completely to Richard. There was a depth in her eyes that surprised him. "You know, my young man, life presents us with many paths. The important thing is to choose the one that brings us peace at the end of the day. Wealth is good, but true value lies in the lives we touch, in the connections we make." Eleanor's words resonated deeply with Richard. For a moment, he felt as if he was speaking not to a stranger, but to someone who knew him intimately. "How can you be so sure?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Eleanor smiled, a smile full of a sadness that Richard didn't fully understand. My dear, life has taught me many lessons, some too painful to tell, but I learned that love is the only thing that truly matters in the end." Richard felt an inexplicable emotion rise in his throat. Without thinking, he brought his hand to his chest, touching the necklace hidden under his shirt. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by Eleanor. Her eyes widened slightly, a spark of recognition passing through them. But she said nothing, just observed Richard with a look that seemed to contain years of unspoken emotions. "Thank you," Richard murmured, standing up. "Your words mean more than you can imagine." As he walked away, Richard felt as if something fundamental had changed inside him. Eleanor's words, combined with the strange familiarity he felt in her presence, triggered a series of questions he could no longer ignore. That night, in his office on the top floor of his skyscraper, Richard made a decision. He cancelled the renovation plans for the apartment complex, opting instead for a gradual improvement program that wouldn't displace current residents. Sarah, surprised by the sudden change, found Richard contemplating the city through his office window. "Are you sure about this, Richard?" she asked, a mixture of concern and admiration in her voice. Richard turned to her, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen in years. A spark of life, of purpose. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life, Sarah. It's time we make a real difference." The days that followed saw a transformation in Richard. He dove headfirst into social responsibility projects, using his influence and resources to make real improvements in people's lives. The apartment complex became a model of affordable and dignified housing, with community programs and green spaces. Eleanor, observing the changes from her small window, felt a mixture of pride and melancholy. Every time she saw Richard walking through the complex, interacting with residents and overseeing improvements, her heart tightened with a mixture of joy and pain. She knew deep in her soul that this man was her son, the boy she had been forced to abandon so many years ago. Weeks turned into months, and the relationship between Richard and Eleanor grew. Although he still didn't know the truth about her identity, Richard found himself increasingly drawn to the wisdom and kindness of the elderly gardener. He began to visit her regularly, helping her with her small garden and listening to her stories. It was during one of these visits that fate decided to reveal its hand. Richard was helping Eleanor plant some new flowers when the necklace he always carried slipped out from inside his shirt. Eleanor froze when she saw the familiar locket swinging from Richard's neck. Her heart raced, and she felt tears forming in her eyes. Richard, noticing her reaction, looked at her with concern. "Eleanor, are you all right?" With trembling hands, Eleanor reached out and gently touched the locket. "This necklace, where did you get it?" The question caught Richard by surprise. He held the locket, a thoughtful expression on his face. I've always had it. It's the only thing I have from my past, before I was adopted. My birth mother gave it to me before." His voice faltered as realization hit him. He looked at Eleanor, really seeing her for the first time. Her eyes, so full of love and pain, were a mirror of his own. "Mom?" The word came out as a whisper, laden with decades of repressed emotions. Eleanor could no longer contain her tears. "Oh, Richard, my boy, my dear boy." The world seemed to stop at that moment. Richard felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. His whole life, all the unanswered questions, all the inexplicable feelings of emptiness, everything converged to this single moment. How Why? The words came out choppy, a mixture of shock and raw emotion. Eleanor, with tears freely flowing down her wrinkled face, began to tell her story. She spoke about crushing poverty, about the desperation of a young single mother, about the hardest decision she ever had to make. "I wanted you to have a chance, Richard, a chance I couldn't give you. But God knows I never stopped loving you, not for a second." Richard listened, stunned. Part of him wanted to scream, to demand to know why she hadn't looked for him before, why she had allowed him to grow up without knowing of her existence. But another part, the part that had always felt something was missing, finally felt complete. "All these years," he murmured, looking at his dirt-stained hands. "You were so close and I didn't even know." Eleanor nodded, a sad smile on her lips. "I watched you from afar, my son. I saw you grow, become a man, and now I see you becoming the man I always knew you could be." Richard looked at her, really seeing her. He saw the hands calloused from hard work, the face marked by time and worries, and at that moment, all the anger he might have felt dissolved, replaced by a deep understanding and a love that transcended time and circumstances. Without saying a word, he moved forward and hugged her. Eleanor sobbed in his arms, decades of repressed love finally finding expression. "I love you, Mom," Richard whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "And I forgive you." In that small garden, among the newly planted flowers and moist soil, mother and son reconnected, filling a void that both had carried for so long. The days that followed were an emotional roller coaster for Richard and Eleanor. Richard struggled to reconcile the image of the mother he had imagined for years with the reality of the woman before him. Eleanor, in turn, oscillated between the indescribable joy of having her son back and the fear that he might reject her once the initial emotion passed. Sarah, observing her husband's transformation, knew that something profound had changed. One evening, while Richard was lost in thought on their apartment balcony, she joined him. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" she asked softly, placing her hand on his shoulder. Richard turned to her, his eyes full of an emotion Sarah rarely saw. "I found my birth mother, Sarah. She's the gardener at the apartment complex." Sarah was silent for a moment, processing the information. "Oh, Richard, wow, how are you feeling?" Richard let out a humorless laugh. "Honestly, I don't know. Part of me is happy, relieved. Another part is angry, confused. It's like my whole life has been turned upside down." Sarah hugged him, offering silent comfort. "You know I'm here for you, no matter what happens." Richard nodded, grateful for his wife's support. In the days that followed, he spent more and more time with Eleanor, learning about her past, sharing stories of his childhood and adolescence. Each conversation was a bittersweet mixture of joy and regret for lost time. Eleanor, in turn, blossomed with her son's presence in her life. Her face, once marked mainly by weariness, now shone with new vitality. She shared with Richard stories of their family, long-forgotten traditions, and precious memories of his early years. It was during one of these conversations that Eleanor casually mentioned the impending eviction. "Eviction?" Richard asked, alarmed. "What are you talking about?" Eleanor sighed, a resigned look on her face. "Oh, it's just life taking its course, my son. I couldn't keep up with the rent increases. Mr. Miller warned me a few weeks ago." Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. The cruel irony of the situation hit him with full force. He, the owner of the complex, was about to evict his own mother without even knowing it. "Eleanor, Mom," he began, his voice trembling slightly. I'm the owner of this complex." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor looked at him, a mixture of shock and understanding slowly spreading across her face. "Oh," was all she could say initially. Then, with a small sad smile, she added, "Well, I suppose fate has a peculiar sense of humor, doesn't it?" Richard stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth in the small apartment. "This can't happen. I won't let this happen. You're not going anywhere, Mom." Eleanor watched him with a mixture of love and concern. "Richard, my dear, you can't change the rules just for my sake. That wouldn't be fair to the other tenants." His mother's words made him stop. He looked at her, seeing not just the woman who brought him into the world, but also the wise and compassionate person she was. At that moment, Richard made a decision that would change not only his life, but the lives of many other people. "You're right. he said finally. "I can't change the rules just for you, but I can change them for everyone." In the days that followed, Richard plunged into a frenzy of activity. He called meetings with his legal and financial team, completely redesigning the ownership structure of the apartment complex. His vision was ambitious, to transform the place into a housing cooperative where residents would have a stake in the ownership and management of the building. Sarah, seeing the passion with which Richard dedicated himself to the project, found herself increasingly involved. She began to use her contacts in the world of philanthropy to raise support and additional resources. "You know," she said to Richard one night as they worked side by side in their home office, "I think I finally understand why you always carried that necklace. It was as if a part of you knew there was something more, something bigger waiting." Richard smiled at her, feeling a wave of gratitude for her understanding and support. "I think you're right. And now I finally feel like I'm on the right path." As plans for the housing cooperative took shape, Richard spent more and more time at the complex, working directly with residents to understand their needs and desires. Eleanor, watching her son interact with the community she considered her extended family, felt her heart overflow with pride. One afternoon, as Richard was helping Eleanor in her now expanded community garden, she paused, looking at him with eyes shining with unshed tears. "You know, Richard," she began, her voice soft, "when I gave you up for adoption, my greatest fear was that you would grow up not knowing what true love is. Seeing you now, the man you've become, the good you're doing, I know I made the right choice, as painful as it was." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "Mom, Eleanor raised her hand, gently silencing him. "Let me finish, my son. I want you to know that even in the hardest moments, even when I barely had anything to eat, I never regretted bringing you into this world. You have always been and always will be the best thing I've ever done." Richard couldn't hold back the tears. He hugged his mother, feeling as if years of pain and separation were finally being healed. If you've watched this far, please consider subscribing to the channel and comment where you live. Back to the story. The months passed, and the housing cooperative project began to take concrete shape. The residents, initially skeptical, began to actively engage, participating in meetings and contributing ideas. The complex, once deteriorated, gained new life with expanded green areas, renovated community spaces, and support programs for residents. Helena, with her gardening experience, took on a leadership role in the complex's landscaping project. Her small garden transformed into an urban oasis with community vegetable gardens and lush leisure areas. Richard, in turn, discovered a new passion in his work. He began to use his business expertise not just to manage the cooperative, but also to create professional training programs for residents. Entrepreneurship classes, practical skills workshops, and mentoring became an integral part of community life. Sarah, inspired by her husband's transformation and Eleanor's story, decided to use her social influence for a greater cause. She organized fundraising and awareness events, bringing attention to issues of affordable housing and support for low-income families. One day, as Richard walked through the complex with Eleanor, observing the positive changes around them, he suddenly stopped, an idea forming in his mind. "Mom," he said, turning to Eleanor with a gleam in his eyes, "what if we could do this on a large scale, not just here, but across the city?" Eleanor looked at her son, seeing in him the same fire and determination she had when she was young. "What do you have in mind, my dear?" Richard began to explain his vision, a support center for single mothers and at-risk children, a place that would offer not just shelter, but also education, professional training, and emotional support. "We could call it Mother's Heart Project," he said, instinctively touching the necklace he still carried. "In your honor?" Forming in her eyes. "Oh, Richard, that would be wonderful. How many lives we could change, how many families we could keep together." In the months that followed, Richard, with Sarah's unconditional support and Eleanor's wise guidance, worked tirelessly to make reality. He sold much of his commercial properties, redirecting resources to the new project. The Mother's Heart Project quickly took shape. An old commercial building was renovated and transformed into a multifunctional center. On the ground floor, a daycare and educational center for children. On the upper floors, cozy apartments for mothers in vulnerable situations. The project also included classrooms for professional courses, a health center, and common areas. Eleanor, despite her advanced age, dove headfirst into the project. Her life experiences became invaluable in designing support programs. She became a maternal figure not just for Richard, but for many of the women and children the center began to serve. Sarah, in turn, used her contacts to secure partnerships with companies and educational institutions, creating internship and employment opportunities for the mothers served by the project. As the Mother's Heart project gained recognition, Richard found himself increasingly sought after by other cities and even governments interested in replicating the model. He traveled frequently, sharing his experience and helping to establish similar projects in other regions. On one of these trips, while presenting the project at an international conference, Richard paused in his speech, touching the necklace he still carried with him. "This project," he said, his voice laden with emotion, "was born from a story of love and sacrifice. A love so great that a mother was able to give up her child to give him a better chance in life. And a son who, decades later, rediscovered that love and found his true purpose." The audience listened in respectful silence as Richard shared his personal story, the separation, the years of unconscious searching, and the miraculous reunion with Eleanor. Many had tears in their eyes when he concluded, "The Mother's Heart Project is not just a social program. It's a promise to all mothers and children facing difficult circumstances. A promise that no matter how dark the night may seem, there is always hope. And that with love, support, and opportunities, we can break the cycle of poverty and build a better future for everyone." As the auditorium erupted in applause, Richard felt a gentle hand on his shoulder. Turning, he saw Sarah, who had traveled as a surprise to support him. By her side was Eleanor, her eyes shining with pride and love. "Mom," exclaimed Richard, surprised and moved. "How did you get here?" Eleanor smiled, caressing her son's face. "You think I'd miss this? Sarah made sure to bring me. Said it was important that I see the impact our story is having on the world." Richard hugged the two women who meant everything to him, feeling a wave of gratitude and love that threatened to overflow. In the years that followed, the Mother's Heart Project continued to grow and evolve. Eleanor, even in her advanced age, remained a driving force, sharing her wisdom and love with each new mother and child who passed through the center. Richard and Sarah, now true partners in life and work, dedicated themselves fully to expanding the project. They had 2 children of their own, raised with the values of compassion and service that had become the core of their lives. On a quiet afternoon, almost a decade after the start of the project, Richard found Eleanor sitting in her favorite garden in the original complex. She looked tired, but her eyes still shone with the same light he had learned to love. "How are you feeling today, Mom?" Richard asked, sitting down beside her. Eleanor smiled, taking her son's hand. "I'm at peace, my dear. More than I ever thought I would be." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of his mother's words. He knew their time together was precious, each moment a gift he didn't take for granted. "You know," Eleanor continued, her voice soft, "when I gave you that necklace, so many years ago, I prayed it would guide you back to me one day. I never imagined it would lead us to do so much good in the world." Richard touched the necklace, which he still wore every day. "This necklace is more than a memento now, Mum. It's a symbol of everything we've built together, of all the lives we've touched." Eleanor nodded, tears of happiness in her eyes. "And to think it all started with an act of love, a love so great it hurt." At that moment, sitting together in the garden Eleanor had tended with such care, mother and son shared a silence full of understanding and gratitude. The necklace, which for so long had been a link to an unknown past, was now a testament to a future built on the foundation of unconditional love. As the sun set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Richard reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him here. From a businessman focused only on profits, he had transformed into someone dedicated to making a difference in the world. And all this thanks to the love of a mother who never gave up, even when everything seemed lost. The Mother's Heart Project continued to flourish, becoming a beacon of hope for thousands of families across the country. Richard and Sarah saw their own children grow up with a deep sense of empathy and social responsibility. inspired by their grandmother Eleanor's legacy. Eleanor, though aging, remained a constant and loving presence in the lives of all around her. Her wisdom, born from a life of challenges and triumphs, continued to guide the project and inspire new generations. Years later, in an emotional ceremony, the original housing complex where it all began was officially renamed Eleanor Gardens. It was a tribute not just to the woman who had touched so many lives, but to all those who, like her, had faced adversity with courage and love. During the inauguration ceremony, Richard took the stage, the necklace gleaming on his chest. He looked out at the crowd, seeing familiar faces and new ones, all united by the spirit of community and hope that the project had cultivated. "This place," he began, his voice laden with emotion, "is more than just a set of buildings. It's a testament to the power of love, the resilience of the human spirit, and the strength we find in each other. My mother, Eleanor, taught me that the true legacy we leave is not in the things we build, but in the lives we touch." As he spoke, Richard saw Eleanor in the front row, her eyes shining with pride and love. Beside her was Sarah and their children, all part of the incredible journey that had brought them here. "The necklace I carry," Richard continued, touching the locket, "was once a symbol of separation and loss. Today, it represents unity, hope, and the transformative power of unconditional love. May Eleanor Gardens always be a place where love flourishes, where hope takes root, and where each person can find the support they need to grow and thrive." As the audience applauded, Richard stepped down from the stage and embraced his mother. In that moment, surrounded by a community they had helped build, they felt the fullness of a journey that had begun with a painful act of love and culminated in a legacy of hope and transformation. The necklace, once a link to an unknown past, now symbolized a bright future, not just for Richard and Eleanor, but for countless families who would find shelter, support, and love in Eleanor Gardens and the many Mother's Heart projects spread across the country. And so the story that began with a painful separation transformed into a testament to the enduring power of maternal love, proving that sometimes the most difficult paths can lead to the most beautiful and meaningful destinations.